Hello, Black Sunrise fans. Our personal consultations are back. To book your consult, please visit blacksunrise.com. You can now schedule half an hour sessions and 1 hour sessions on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Tuesdays and Wednesdays 12 to 5:30 p.m. and Fridays 12 to 6 p.m. Please remember to spell Black Sunrise BlackSonrise. I look forward to hearing from you. Okay, we are back with our guest today. And we left off speaking about ancestry and spirituality. Can you tell us your handle on Instagram again?
My handle on Instagram is birthforce18, and like the word birth and the word force and the number 18.
Okay, so Birth Force 18 is here with us again. So we left off talking about why you cannot be a spiritual person without knowing your family tree. Now, let's start with the spirituality. Well, how does spirituality affect your family tree, and how does your family tree affect spirituality?
Very good question. Because there is a such thing as like spiritual DNA, for example, or where spirit we know is linked to water, for example. So we can bring it from the spookiness of the sky gods and so forth. Let's bring it right down to earth where it's very practical, right? So we know the medium of spirit is water. That's established. Anyone can do research, anything that deals with spirituality, know that water is the medium of spiritual energy and power. The body is what? 70% plus water. The brain is mostly water. DNA is nothing but chemical, is what? A chemical compound. A, T, C, G, those are just the chemical basis, which is what? Liquid. So it's been proven by science that memory is retained in water. Water holds memory. So as the spirit is mediated through water, therefore the water is the medium of spirit, and all of what you're made of with the blood is what? Liquid. The blood is liquid. The body is made up mostly of water. Definitely the brain, so in all of our organs is saturated with what? Water and liquid. And the memory of spirit is contained in the water, which means that says that spirit can be what? Contaminated as well, or purified based on how we eat, how we think, what we experience. And then, of course, we know that there's a such thing as epigenetics, where that's memory that is impressed upon the person based on the environment, and that's transmitted from generation to generation. So that means that can include trauma or great things. Or just like, for example, a good example is like, that boy sure do act like Pawpaw. Or there's families that are like great musicians, right? Or shoemakers, so forth and so on. That's all spiritual. Because this power of spirit is like talent, skill, or ability. That's how you see how spirit is expressed. And those things are passed down genetically. They're not like out of the air. Some people can be trained. That's true. That's like initiation. You can be initiated into something and activate that spirit power. But for the most part, a lot of the spiritual inheritance is inherited genetically. So that means you have to know your ancestry. It can't be like some blank, clean slate, in terms of activating your spiritual power and ancestry, because the DNA contains the memory and the instruction of who you are, where you came from, where you're going, your structure, how you were formed. It carries all of the memory, all of the genetics. And there was one experiment that was done by scientists not long ago. I'll find the article, whereas they actually uploaded like terabytes of data into DNA. They downloaded it and then they uploaded it back to a computer. So there you have it.
That's beautiful. So a person who is on the...
Are you there?
Sorry about that. I had you muted so that you would so that I wouldn't interrupt. So a person who is on the path of spiritual development must spend time. What percentage do you think that of spiritual development a person must allocate time to putting their family tree together?
Oh, that's a lifetime. You can't even put an hour or a minute. That's something that you have to be devoted to. And
Right.
Some people who do not, take that route because they don't think that that's like really important. They engage in things like meditation, yoga, initiation to various types of initiatory societies to help them to activate. But I will always say that if you don't know the ancestry, this will unleash, if you will, like you will open the vortex to that spiritual empowerment. Even though you can obtain it too, through, like I said, through meditation, yoga, and all these various kinds of spiritual disciplines that everyone knows about: astrology, numerology, forms of divination, which I don't call it divination. I would say the information retrieval systems. The spiritual scientific information retrieval system, like many of your audience probably know, like IFA. IFA is just a spiritual information retrieval system. It's a spiritual computer. That's what it is. And it is associated with genetics. That's why you're not going to find any major or non-major African culture that does not venerate the ancestors. That is why. It's not because they're worshiping like Western academics say, they're ancestral worship. That's a lie. What they're doing is activating their DNA. The spiritual DNA is being activated. That's all it is. Opening up vortexes. Let me give you, here's an example of experience that I had. This is my experience. It doesn't matter to me who believes me or not. I don't care. And I want to stress that I do not care. So, one day I went into meditation, and what I did was, the instruction I was given was to gather together all of my death certificates of this particular line. But then again, on my Williams line, this is my great-great-grandfather who, is said to have come from Africa, who was a Nago, which today they call Yoruba, which the Nagos are the Yorubas that were like in Dahomey or whatever the case may be, or the Bight of Benin, okay? And that they were shipped to him, and 7 of his brothers and sisters were shipped to Jamaica. And he was sold away, supposedly, from the island, his brothers and sisters on the island, to South Carolina, where he became immersed in, the Gullah Geechee community. And then from there to a place called Greenville, South Carolina, from Greenville, South Carolina to Dallas County, Alabama. And so he was a William. Alani, his African name was Alani, but in this country they would say Allen, right? So Alani Williams. So I gathered together all of the death certificate, but something told me, no, also bring the ones that's on your maternal side too, because I have Williams. My mother's maiden name is Williams, and my father's mother's maiden name is Williams. So I brought those death certificates together and put them in like this sheet, this clear sheet holder, and I put it under my pillow, and I went into meditation. All of a sudden, I was teleported into the other realm, to, I guess you can call it the ancestral realm. And I know it was that because daylight was a soft blue color. and it was a man. He was trying to talk to me. He was telling me, he was giving me some information, and I was in such great awe that I made it over to this world that I couldn't believe it, and I didn't know how long that I would hold my place in that world before I was sucked back into this world. And so before I was drawn back into this world, I asked him, I said, what is your ethnic group? But I did not listen to what he was saying. He was talking to me. He was giving me a message, but I could not hear him because I was so enthralled about being in this world that I was, experiencing. And then before I was snapped back into this world, I asked him, what tribe did you come from? Because I wanted him to say Yoruba. So I was just so wanted him to say that so bad, but he didn't. He said Dogon. And then all of a sudden I came back to this world, and I looked up at the ceiling where I thought I came back. I looked up to the ceiling, and it was a vortex. And descending out of the vortex were watches, gold and silver coins, rings, necklaces, and all forms of jewels. And then I looked down to the ground to see, if they had dropped there. And then that's when I so-called woken up. You see? Mm-hmm. So that was an ancestral visitation that tells me, and it was a spiritual encounter. And that ancestor told me that he was a Dogon, which to my selfishness, I was so disappointed because I wanted him to say Yoruba or Nago, right? Because this ancestor that I was told said, he was a Yoruba from West Africa. The obituary of my aunt says it. He was a Yoruba from Nigeria, West Africa, and so forth and so on. But in that message, that person did not tell me that. He said Dogon. That's one experience. Another experience. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Another encounter that I had, which is also spiritual. So this was another visitation. And this visitation, it was this man. He was wearing a white tunic and white trousers, and he had on a red cap. And he says to me, he said, most of your ancestors that came from what they called Nigeria were Igbo. The only reason why we accept you in that Yoruba stuff is because we have the same divination system. And then I woke up. That was the profundity, the profundity of that experience was so great, so powerful. How could, someone, I would have such a kind of dream like that. I wasn't thinking about anything of that nature, but that's what I mean by spiritual connection and ancestry. And so that stayed with me for a long time. I said, that was amazing. So afterwards, I did research because prior to that, I had not known, and I started researching the Igbo divination system, and I didn't realize that the Dibia, they use Afa, and Afa is nothing but Ifa. I said, wow, so this was an ancestor from a spiritual experience that gave me information about a part of my ancestry and a part of their information retrieval science that I had not known previously. So I know that it was true because it was verified in the real world that the Dibia does use Afa. And Afa is the same as Ifa of the Yoruba, you see? And so that stayed with me for a whole year. And then I said, you know what, I'm going to do that naming ceremony through DNA tested African ancestry that's sponsored by Chief Chinyere. She's an Igbo princess. She was crowned an Igbo princess in Igbo land, an African American woman. So I did that. I went through the naming ceremony to acquire an Igbo name, right? Okay. So my time came for the chief. It was an actual Igbo chief who gave me my name. And as soon as he gave me the name, a voice came. It was like in my ear, like someone whispering. He says, after he said the name, Okodile, just in that instant, a voice said, "Go the family into slavery." And at first, I wanted to be frightened, but the spirit said, "Don't be afraid. Calm down. Take a deep breath. Don't be scared." the voice said, the uncle sold the family into slavery. And after that, you know, even though the princess and people got the other names and they were talking, were saying like, how do you feel? You know, what was your experience like? I could not concentrate after that, after having that experience. So I had two, you want to call it supernatural, whatever you want to call it. It was my experience. I don't care if no one believes me. I do not care. Now I want to stress that. Dear Birth Force 18, I do not care. I had the experience with the evil men who told me that most of my ancestors who came from Nigeria were evil, and that the only reason why, because I was into leukemia at that time, the only reason why we accept you into that Yoruba stuff, and he said it just like that, Yoruba stuff, is because we have the same divination system. And then a year later in December, I think it was December 20th, I went to the naming ceremony, and that voice said, the uncle's going. That's what I'm talking about. That's the kind of doors that were open.
I can affirm that you're telling the truth. Not only that, you answered a lot of questions for me that I had last night. You didn't know, but last night I was up late and I was speaking to the mother of creation because I had some turmoil in my spirit I need to get out. And as I began to speak to the mother of all creation, some memories came back to me. You didn't know this happened. And one of the memories that I had was when I was a child, because I was still trying to find out what happened to me when I was 13 years old. And then a dream, and I believe that I was in that dream, I was in the room in my aunt's house that I grew up in, the very room where I went to sleep for 3 days. And I was standing in front of my dresser looking in the mirror. And all of a sudden I felt something playing with my vagina. And I jumped. And I was like, oh my God, there's nothing here. Then my spirit said, open the door. And when all the doors in her house were sliding doors. They didn't open ajar, they slid. So when I opened the door, all of a sudden, on the other side of the door was this, I don't know what it was, but it was 9 feet tall. And the head of this man was 3 times the size of its body. And he had on a dirty turban, a dirty white turban on his head. And he had a remote control in his hand. And every time he pushed the remote control button, I felt something in my vagina and I jumped. And then all of a sudden, he realized that I saw him. And when he realized I saw him, he pulled out a sword from his side. He was 9 feet tall. The sword that he pulled out was about my size. And he swung it for my head and I ducked. And when I ducked, I pulled out a sword. And the two of us were clashing in my aunt's house until finally I overpowered him and I pushed him out of the back of the house, which was where the kitchen was, out into the middle of the night. When I turned around, I saw my aunt's son on a bed doing some kind of ritual. He was throwing some kind of powder on a bed. And I turned to my aunt. This is right before she died. And I turned to her and I said to her, I said, listen, I already pushed it out of the house. What is he doing? So she says to her son, oh, stop doing that. And then all of a sudden, she turns and she glides towards her bathroom. Now, her shower was separate from the toilet. So you had one room that was the shower, one room that was the toilet. So she was gliding towards her shower, and then she went into the shower under running water. All of a sudden, I looked down at my feet, and I saw this giant crab from like the bottom of the ocean crawl past my feet, crawl under the shower door, and went into the shower with my aunt. And then I woke up.
Wow.
It was funny you said what you said today, because I look back now and I realize, I said that wasn't just a dream telling me what she was doing. It was a dream showing me ancestry. You see, that was the revelation I received last night. And then you telling me, reminding me about these dreams that you had that is directly correlated to genetics and ancestry. And I would like to add, not all of us have ancestry that's from the land. I'll leave that there, right? Those who have ears to hear, let them hear, right? Another interesting thing that you mentioned was you said that the people in what they call Nigeria today, which is a British construct, was called Nago. Now, what you may or may not know is that the Caribs, which is my grandmother's side of the family, what they called Trinidad, okay, Trinidad is not the correct name. The correct name for Trinidad is Cali Nago. And my grandmother is from Cali Nago, and we know exactly where she descended from. She descended from the island of Chakachakari or Shakashakari, pronounced by the Carib Chakachakari. Okay. When I had the crook, Chinaza, who was Igbo, and he's a crook, I asked him, I said, somebody said to me, ask Chinaza what these words mean. And funny enough, even though he's a crook, he began telling me, he said, I know these words. These words are Igbo words. But what I find interesting is I'm like, I have a feeling there were tribes that were exterminated. Or my grandmother ended up so mixed that she genetically does not look like people from West Africa, because they don't look like my mother, my grandmother. They don't look like people from West Africa. And I've been trying to find the tribe that they look like. What they do look like is Carib. So I found it interesting that the people of the region that they call Nigeria is Nago, and the people of Trinidad, the original name is Cali Nago. Do you think there's some similarities there, or there's a link there?
I would go out on the limb and say that most likely it probably is, because there's no way, that's not coincidental. I wouldn't consider that like coincidental. And plus, we know that a lot of Nagos or Yorubas went to Trinidad, a lot of them. But many of them were like indentured. I don't think they went there as slaves, like the ancestors I had. They went to Jamaica. Some of them were, because they say that was enslaved. So I can't use that, because I know that there were some indentured Nagos that went to Jamaica too, like 10,000 after, the British and the United States so-called were suppressing the so-called transatlantic slave trade. And when they liberated those different slave ships, those different ships where they were smuggled, they dropped them off at different places. And some went to Trinidad and some went to Jamaica. And see, there's probably maybe some connection there. And then they mixed with, mixed with the local population, the Caribs.
Okay. That would make sense, because the Kalinago, the name Kalinago, existed before the transatlantic slave trade, which proves to me, and we have the records to prove this, that the Africans were traveling to the Americas long before Columbus.
Absolutely.
Right? And this is something that I think it's very fascinating. Another piece of interesting genetics and archaeology that I think people need to look into is not just your ancestry in terms of the people where you come from, not just your ancestry in terms of spirituality, but ancestry in terms of migration and archaeogenetics. And the ancestry with archaeogenetics, I found to be the most fascinating thing, because that combination is called archaeogenetics, literally shows you your genetics in your entire bloodline, including the admixtures and the lands they're tied to, the times in history they're tied to, edifices like, castles, forts, ancient archaeological sites like caves, they're tied to. Like if they found one of your ancestors in a cave 20,000 years ago and they trace the DNA and there's a match between you and them, civilizations. So what do you think about archaeogenetics? Tying people.
Oh, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. Tying people to land, not just land, but castles, forts, caves. I mean, kingdoms, archaeological sites, digs, graveyards. Do you think this is something that people should look into?
That is absolutely something that's important to investigate. That's where I think where we have to invest our time and monies to develop that area, because it's mostly developed for other people, not necessarily us per se. Although I'm sure there's been ample research that's been done hidden behind the scenes of different caves and different burial sites that have not been released to the world, that many of these archaeologists that are archaeogeneticists have not discovered, have found, on and off the continent. So yes, that's like very critical. An excellent example is that I think this research was like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where archaeologists went into a cave in southwestern Ethiopia among the Amadic people, the Ari people, and discovered that, there was bones there, of course, and so they extracted the DNA from the bone marrow, if I'm not mistaken, but I know it was the bone, and that it was discovered that the male person tested positive for EV38, which is the Y-DNA haplogroup EV38, of which I'm positive for EV38 as well. And this person speaks the so-called Afro-Asiatic languages, of which in most of these population genetic studies, they try to project that these so-called Afro-Asiatic speakers were Eurasian, but this backfired, and that proved otherwise, that's like a lie. So this was done. This genetics was pulled from a site, a archaeological site that was in a cave, which is an example of what you're talking about, which is why it's so important, because the discovery of truth, which goes back to what you were saying about folks, everyone is not from West Africa, but see that haplogroup, which is most prevalent in West Africa, was found in East Africa in a cave in Southeast Africa, in Southwest Ethiopia. You see?
Absolutely. I wanna shift your attention just a little bit. When I was doing some research on archaeogenetics and I was looking at someone's file, one of their ancestors was a so-called slave in Maryland, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here is where it gets really interesting. So they were tracking in this person's line, they were tracking the lineage of a specific pharaoh, okay, in so-called Egypt. And they found that this person's grandfather, who was a slave in Maryland, also had a relative in Southern Africa in they weren't Zulu, they were, I think they were Khoi. They had another relative in East Africa, in Sudan, and then they were directly related to Ramesses III. Here is why archaeogenetics became super real for me. When I saw this looking at someone else's genetics, years before that, and this goes back to what he was saying about it's living. And this is the reason why we started off the conversation with DNA and people being lost because their DNA has been killed. DNA in terms of ancestry. And let me make this quick, because we have 30 seconds. I was told by a friend of mine who knew an archaeologist. And the archaeologist, long before I discovered this, said to her, "You blacks in the Americas don't know who you are." He was an African archaeologist. He said, "You descended from Khamit." He said, "You came to the West. You were the last tribe to come to the West. And when they came with guns, we didn't want to give up our mothers and fathers. So we had no choice but to hand you over." And that was told to me about 3 years ago. And then I saw it when I was looking at someone else's genetics. We got 12 seconds.
That's very interesting. So, yeah, that migrations from the east